awareness will not be just stopping. But the problem is, I think President Obama, of course, could capitalize a lot from his even just 6 hours prior duty to Myanmar. I think he usually being much strongly motivated for two things. One is using his visit, just setting some sort of very good example. If a country, particularly a local state, could just behave very well in American standards, then he will reward very greatly. The second is, I think he also can use this to send a strong message to other local states. If you, some sort of, we say, the bad guys in the international community could follow up with the U.S., then U.S. will warmly reach out. So I think 6 hours, but it's very meaningful tour for him.
James, do you think President Obama tries during the whirlwind 6 hour tour to strike a balance between praising the government's progress in shaking off the military rule and pressing for more reform politically?
Well, I think the United States faces a difficult test here because this is only year 2 of 2 to 3 of these reforms in Myanmar. Some in the United States think it's too quickly for a presidential visit, that the U.S. should be not making close relations with Myanmar, but instead push strongly on further reforms, further human rights improvements before the U.S. would take such movements to ease sanctions and so forth. But I think it's certainly significant, and I think, in my opinion, was probably the right time and the wise decision by the United States to move forward.
Are you surprised that President Obama was given a warm welcome by the junta members of the Burmese government? And at the same time, President Obama said his visit to Myanmar should not be viewed as an endorsements of the Burmese government, but rather a process that is underway in that country, and a process that no one foresaw 1.5 years ago.
I think such a remark sounds too much diplomatic, but also at the same time too much American, because we know Myanmar's democratization, of course, moving with a great momentum. If we look back the past 2 years, I think Myanmar's domestic politics truly tremendously changed. So it's just not serve the Americans' interest, but also could just as way discussion set an example on how such a local state could evolve, serving some sort of American standards international community. So for that point, as President Obama's visit is a big reward. Is there some sort of a big recognition of the junta government, what the junta government has, I think, done in the past couple of years. But on the other hand, of course, we used to like to push not just gently, and sometimes push also harder for some sort of further, I think, the change as requested in the U.S.
But James, last year we were all impressed by the bear hug that Secretary Clinton gave to Aung San Suu Kyi, the most famous human rights activist in Asia. Probably she's called Asia's Nelson Mandela. However, among the 300 prisoners released by the Burmese government, none of them was on the list of those demanded by Amnesty International. Do you think this historic trip by President Obama is a tour of reward for the progress that has been made by the junta government, or rather his visit would not be rewarded by the host country?
Well, I agree with what the sentiments offered, and I think one lesson the U.S. perhaps learned was in Iran, when there were similar mild political reforms a decade or so ago. The U.S. under President Obama, well, not much sooner, when President Obama first came to office, the U.S. sort of chose to ignore some of those achievements and then seen as backsliding. So I think by getting out in front is new for President Obama, and I think it is a reward for past behavior, but hoping it will propel into the future further reforms, and including addressing some of the people you've mentioned.
Zhu Feng, do you think China has been brought to the edge of its seat? Because after all, Myanmar is a very close friend of China, it's not an ally in Asia, and this country is a point of entry for China to ship its oil and gas supplies from the Middle East, from Indonesia, from the Indian Ocean to its own continent, and therefore we cannot afford to lose this stronghold.
Of course, Yang Rui, you raised the point. I think Myanmar matters a lot for Chinese.
It means a lot for China.
Of course. So we're investing a lot. We're constructing the pipelines. We're now also helping Myanmar develop its social and economic infrastructure. So no one can just, become ignorant to what the U.S. is doing with the Myanmar government. But the problem is, my view is that we can't be over crazy or over estimate with what is U.S. is doing at the Myanmar. If the both power, U.S. and China, we can cooperate, then join the hand. I see such China and the U.S. The efforts could just have not just a big boost for Myanmar's some sort of rejuvenation and democratization, but also could just stabilize the Myanmar's economy and build some sort of a very successful new Myanmar. It serves the China's interest in long run.
James, do you think there is a quiet competition between the U.S. and China in Myanmar? Because after all, China thinks and believes that Myanmar is of a great strategic importance. As I said earlier, in importing oil from the Indian Ocean, bypassing the Malacca Strait, which is quite vulnerable and fragile militarily or in whatever sense for China.
Well, I don't think China loses anything in this opening to the United States by Myanmar. I think the U.S. in a sense could be seen as having been in a losing position. Historic allies like Thailand and Singapore and others in the region have also very good relations with China, but some countries like Myanmar and Vietnam had good relations with China but virtually no relations with the United States.
Despite the morale-boosting nature of this current official visit by President Obama, what else can the U.S. do? Because many people would view his 6-hour trip as more symbolic than substantive compared to China's formidable economic presence in Myanmar. Because for years, Myanmar has been isolated by the U.S., to say nothing of the economic embargo. By the way, a ban was just removed to allow export of Myanmar goods to the U.S. market. But that's too little compared to the enormous economic influence of China that we established for years.
Well, this has been a diplomatic offensive of President Obama's pivot to Asia. If it became more of a security pivot where we actually saw true escalation of military forces, attempts to make docking rights for U.S. vessels in countries like Myanmar, or even agreements to have some sort of bases in countries that are not traditional allies of the United States, Cam Ranh Bay and Vietnam, etc., that would be very dramatic. I don't think the U.S., though, is necessarily gaining anything economically in all of these efforts. Though we talk about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I think that is more of a symbolic organization as well. So I think in the terms of the economic gain, China will continue to have success with commercial relations. The U.S. is risky there.
Professor Zhu Feng, do you think the proactive pivot to Asia by the U.S. has somehow embarrassed members of ASEAN, the most successful economic regional bloc, other than the Eurozone? Because politicians, movers and shakers in this region have to consider whether they should take side in any possible standoff strategically between the two giants.
I don't think the regional members, including ASEAN countries, absolutely need to take the sides, because if we look at the regional security scenarios or landscape, we see there is emerging a very interesting new structure. I call it dual track. For example, in security, maybe most of the regional members decisively lean to the U.S., but in return, economically, I think the most of the region members also are very strongly sticking with China. So then such a sense, not just to highlight some sort of the effects of the globalization, but also just to offer us a very interesting portrait of how even U.S. and China, I think, are very highly interdependent.
But there are a couple of flashpoints out there in this region. For example, the Diaoyu Islands, in South China Sea, we have also territorial claims. Now, do you think the vulnerability and the frailty of this newly emerging strategic partnership between Washington and Beijing threatens to be destroyed overnight by any hostilities that may occur between Japan and China?
Well, I think the long-term U.S.-China relationship is foundationally strong in economic, diplomatic, and even a beginning of security dialogues. So I don't see any threat to the relationship, because I think it's the most important relationship in the world. But I think the Diaoyu
You mean the relationship between Washington and Beijing is the most important?
Yes, I think it's the most important global relationship and the most important bilateral relationship for each country. But the relationship between Japan and China, I think, is the more tense and the more unpredictable, and could harm the relationships between the two countries, as the South China Sea dispute could damage relations, and Vietnam, Philippines have those states.
Dr. Zhu Feng, do you think, despite the China-bashing tone in rhetoric of both Mitt Romney and President Obama in the campaign, the Obama administration has somehow soft-toned its anti-China rhetoric after winning the re-election? Because after all, both Secretary Clinton and President Obama made it very clear that they welcome the peaceful rise of a strong and prosperous China. The U.S. is ready to exercise global governance together with Peking. But the problem is whether China is ready.
Yes, I think the question is
we have brushed aside the idea and the
Yep.
proposal of a
Yep.
G2.
Yep.
That has worried the Europeans for quite a while.
Of course, your question is excellent. I think, of course, if we look at just a newly ended election campaign, we see most of the time the candidate will be very rhetorically strong and offensive. But after, for example, the election is gone, then the candidates or newly re-elected president also have to back to the normal. So then I will see the President Obama will continue to come after pragmatism in his handling of the relations with China. But another question is, just you say, how much China is also ready to just handle relations, because almost at the same time both countries have the power transition, have some sort of a new leadership in place. So then I hope interplay between the two countries with regard to some sort of new government could create some sort of new momentum for both sides to have a healthy, stable, and constructive relations.
President Obama said in his letter of congratulations to Mr. Xi Jinping, the newly elected leader of the Chinese Communist Party, that the U.S. government is ready to join hand with China in exercising global and regional leadership. We'll come back to examine that and other issues after the short break. Stay with us. President Obama started the U.S. president's first official visit to Myanmar. Will the U.S. pivot to Asia cause more quiet regional tensions?
There is a lot to do.
We simply would not be able to do that effectively without allies like Australia.
Australia pledges to take the opportunities offered by the Asian Century in its newly released white paper. Is there still zero-sum game in an Asian century? Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Fu Ying said that China hopes the upcoming East Asia Summit may promote regional cooperation.
With the neighboring countries, we should treat each other as good neighbors and treat each other as partners.
Will China's goodwill reconciliation help ease security concerns of neighboring countries? And how will President Obama work with China's new leadership to promote U.S.-China relations in his second term? Welcome back. American leaders say over and over that they are willing to take China as a newly emerging global player, but then at the same time, China says, wait a minute, we're not ready yet. We think we are still the largest developing country. Therefore, China is viewed as pretty hesitant in assuming what the U.S. sees as corresponding responsibilities as a global player. What do you think of the mixed feelings on the Chinese side?
Well, I think to follow the dual-track approach put forward, I think China is not yet a military superpower. It's certainly a power in the region. Economically, I think it's a superpower, and I would not any longer use the term developing country. I think maybe we might even have 300 million middle-class people in China, which is the size of the entire United States, and certainly that's going to continue to grow and incomes will rise. I think the United States would like to see China be a stakeholder in global issues of the environment at the UN Security Council related to Syria and all these different issues, and find opportunities to work together as partners. And I think that would see China becoming fully confident of its global role and its potential.
But at the same time, Mr. Zhu Feng, the U.S. has the legacy of the Cold War, namely 5 military alliances with or treaties with Asian powers. Therefore, plus the U.S. wants to forge a new, meaningful, if not questionable, relationship with India and Vietnam in its effort to stifle the rise of China in the eyes of the Chinese observers. Do you think we can trust the U.S.? Because trust deficit is first and foremost the most important problem between the two powers, right?
Yes, I think the trust issue usually is very lenient or luxury affairs between U.S. and China because our relationship is very, very systemic. It's a systemic relationship, we say, because U.S. is dominant power, China is rising power. In security, I think there's such a complexity, always hunting both sides. So then I can't answer, so China would like to trust, or U.S. also would like to trust China either. But the problem is we have to look at this reality. There's no way to keep the both sides completely apart because we are too big to fail. So if we can have this in mind, so I'm joining the James for his judge. So in long run, our relations will be improving. But the problem is how to navigate through the stormy water. For example, so we have the new leadership, then how such a both sides just build some sort of acquaintance and getting along well with each other. I think it's also a crucial challenge for both sides for the time being.
The U.S. leaders and the Chinese counterparts are likely to meet on the sidelines of the East Asia Summit, the 15th of its kind since its founding. But what do you think of Japan, which is viewed as the major stumbling block between China and the U.S.? I don't think Premier Wen Jiabao is likely to meet with his Japanese counterpart, who has just dissolved the House of Representatives, or lower house of the Japanese Diet, in the hope of winning re-election, although that's a big question mark. LDP is ready to take it over. But let's put the Japanese politics aside for a while. What do you think of the triangle relationship between Japan, China, and the U.S.?
Well, to start with your initial point, I think Japan has a growth of nationalist voices. Shinzo Abe probably would be a little bit more nationalistic than the current Prime Minister Noda, and Shintaro Ishihara is creating a new political party and pulling the country sometimes into hostility with China, but also concern about the U.S.-based presence and the role of the United States. So I think everything is very much in flux. Japan is perhaps more dynamic than, I think, China and the U.S. I think we understand both countries' perspectives, but I think Japan feels the rise of China more greatly than the United States does, and is, in a sense, not as certain of U.S. commitment to the future. And that's been, on the Clinton years, the U.S. forged better relations with China than it had been in the past. That makes Japan nervous. So I think Japan is in a precarious position, and we have to see how it affects the relationship.
Brazilian President Lula joked that in the morning he says hello to one Japanese Prime Minister, but in the afternoon he's going to say hello to yet another Japanese Prime Minister the same day. So that shows somehow the embarrassing frequency of the cabinet reshuffle, changes of prime ministers in Japan. Let me come back to examine the complexity that ASEAN, the regional economic bloc, is facing. What do you think of the issue of unity? Last time China was accused of dividing ASEAN because that bloc failed to pass a joint statement on the issue of South China Sea territorial disputes. Mr. Zhu Feng.
Yeah, I think the ASEAN so far turned out to be a very complicated story. On the one hand, we see the increase in the cohesion within this sub-regional organization is unstoppable, the appeal to all the politicians on individualistic country. But on the other hand, in terms of technical, the barriers, it's also hard to just, bring the organization over to the high level of the integration. So we can see in the past 10 years, ASEAN has been always struggling for to what extent such a cohesion could bring all the regional members together. I think that things has little to do with China and more to do with some sort of the peculiar, the position of the ASEAN right now. So then I can say I'm very optimistic about how fast such a ASEAN-driven integration will go. It will be always at a bumpy road.
Despite the widespread disillusionment shared by Asian leaders about the second or double-dip recession of the Eurozone, ASEAN aims to become, to walk its own way. Now, Prime Minister Hun Sen of Cambodia said in his opening speech that ASEAN is ready to construct 3 communities, political, economic, and cultural communities. But at the same time, he also pinpointed the difficulties. For example, the issue of tariffs and non-tariffs and the lack of infrastructure, free investment, so on and so forth. Do you think with this whole range of issues confronting ASEAN, they are likely to consolidate their unity?
I don't think we're likely to see deeper integration. I think ASEAN's function in the global sense is as this opportunity for major powers to talk, and certainly the United States prefers ASEAN to be building toward APEC, toward the regional forum, to summits that include many countries. I think another path could be the ASEAN +3, which might be in the long run with Korea, Japan, and China, a fruitful way for these countries in East Asia and Southeast Asia to forge partnerships. But I think the countries of Southeast Asia are very keen on non-interference in each other's domestic affairs, respecting state sovereignty, and I think protecting their national economies, sometimes using tariffs. So I don't see even a free trade area truly developing.
Vice Foreign Minister Fu Ying has brushed aside the spat about territorial claims in her interview with the local media in Southeast Asia. She said China would rather emphasize the importance of economic cooperation, making a full use of the 10+1 FTA framework. What do you think of her remarks?
Of course, I think Madame Fu Ying made a great point, because if we look at even just the past few years, then we'll see the China-ASEAN free trade zone not just put into effect, but also create some sort of a new momentum for ASEAN's economic developments. So China has very greatly and significantly proved a big utility for such good relations between ASEAN and China. But yes, we have some sort of territorial disputes. But I think that China's response so far also is manageable and reasonable. So the key issue is, in what way the China-ASEAN could just very successfully just handle the territorial issues, and simultaneously also could bring both sides into some sort of a new political and diplomatic discourse, and to underlining their, such a new development almost in all the terms. So then territorial dispute is bad, but it does not mean it will be deadly destruction. It should be conviction for all the sides.
Now, towards the end of this very interesting conversation, gentlemen, what do you think of the role of Australia? Because that government has just released its white paper on Asian century, and it says that Australia welcomes the rise of China. It doesn't have to take side in any possible standoff between the U.S. and China geopolitically. What do you think of its latest effort to reorient itself to Asia?
Well, I think the previous Labour Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, who spoke fluent Chinese, initiated this move, and then the person that was ousted by, Julia Gillard, I think has followed through. I think domestically Australia has more and more Asian population inside the country. I think the reality is they're well positioned for the future. They have a lot of mineral resources. They can export products. They can trade. And I think as long as this party remains in power, I think it will continue to look toward Asia rather than the West.
Australia seems to be quite divided between the West and Asia for quite a few years. This time around, due to the robust economic ties with the PRC in terms of importing mining and iron ore, for example, that has benefited this country enormously. What do you think of the latest policy options by Canberra?
I think that Canberra used this newly issued, the statement, or we say the document, just unequivocally just signaling China and the U.S. So Australian evaluate both security and economic prosperity. I think so far such a message is very positive.
Australia is not alone. If you look at India and Moscow, they are both divided between the West and the East because of the inevitable rise of Asia. Many people are talking about the rise of Asia. In this latest white paper about the Asian century, Australia says it welcomes the rise of a strong and prosperous China, and that it will not take sides in the strategic competition between Washington and Beijing. This clear position may represent the popular sentiments of most Asian politicians and has complicated U.S. efforts to stifle the alleged assertiveness of its top creditor. In fact, both Beijing and Washington need to figure out how to engage each other in a new relationship based on practical cooperation instead of a confrontation. I'm Yang Rui. See you next time. Bye for now.
Awareness will not be just stopping, but the problem is, I think President Obama, of course, could capitalize a lot from his even just 6 hours prior duty to Myanmar. I think he usually been much strongly motivated for two things. One is using his visit, just setting some sort of very good example. If a country, particularly a local state, could just behave very well in American standards, then he will reward very greatly. The second is, I think he also can use this to send a strong message to other local states. If you, some sort of, we say, the bad guys, the international community, could follow up with the U.S., then U.S. will warmly reach out. So I think 6 hours, but it's very meaningful tour for him.
James to Myanmar should not be viewed as an endormance of the Burmese government, but rather a process that is underway in that country, and a process that no one foresaw 1.5 years ago.
I think such a remark sounds too much diplomatic, but also at the same time too much American, because we know Myanmar's democratization, of course, moving with a great momentum. If we look back the past 2 years, I think Myanmar's domestic politics truly tremendously changed. So it's just not serve the Americans' interest, but also could, just as way discussion, set an example on how such a local state could evolve, serving some sort of American standards, international community. So for that point, as President Obama's visit is a big reward. Is there some sort of a big recognition of the junta government, what the junta government has, I think, done in the past couple of years. But on the other hand, of course, we used to like to push not just gently, and sometimes push also harder for some sort of further, I think, the change as requested in the U.S.
But James, last year we were all impressed by the bear hug that Secretary Clinton gave to Aung San Suu Kyi, the most famous human rights activist in Asia. Probably she's called Asia's Nelson Mandela. However, among the 300 prisoners released by the Burmese government, none of them was on the list of those demanded by Amnesty International. Do you think this historic trip by President Obama is a tour of reward for the progress that has been made by the junta government? Or rather, do you think President Obama tries during the whirlwind 6-hour tour to strike a balance between praising the government's progress in shaking off military rule and pressing for more reform politically?
Well, I think the United States faces a difficult test here because this is only year 2 of 2 to 3 of these reforms in Myanmar. Some in the United States think it's too quickly for a presidential visit, that the U.S. should be not making close relations with Myanmar, but instead push strongly on further reforms, further human rights improvements before the U.S. would take such movements to ease sanctions and so forth. But I think it's certainly significant, and I think, in my opinion, was probably the right time and the wise decision by the United States to move forward.
Are you surprised that President Obama was given a warm welcome by the junta members of the Burmese government? And at the same time, President Obama said his visit, his visit would not be rewarded by the host country.
Well, I agree with the sentiments offered, and I think one lesson the U.S. perhaps learned was in Iran when there were similar mild political reforms a decade or so ago. The U.S. under President Obama, well, not much sooner, when President Obama first came to office, the U.S. sort of chose to ignore some of those achievements and then seen as backsliding. So I think by getting out in front is new for President Obama, and I think it is a reward for past behavior, but hoping it will propel into the future further reforms, and including addressing some of the people you've mentioned.
Zhu Feng, do you think China has been brought to the edge of its seat? Because after all, Myanmar is a very close friend of China, it's not an ally in Asia, and this country is a point of